Hey guys, tonight we journey through the sticky, bubbling alleyways of medieval cuisine. Imagine open trenches of fish guts steaming in the sun, turnip stew that's been reheated for the 5th time this week, and bread so hard it doubles as self-defense. There's no refrigeration, no clean water, and not even the concept of a snack. Oh, and you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the thick of a medieval town square. It's late afternoon. The cobblestones are slick with who knows what, and somewhere nearby, someone is boiling cabbage. Permanently. It's the kind of smell that clings to your cloak and your soul. Vendors shout over one another in accents so thick you swear they're making it up. And yet, somehow, you understand the urgent cry of fresh eel pies. And 2 for a farthing. Food is all around you, but it's not good food. You approach a stall where a large woman is slapping something gray and steaming into a wooden bowl. Pottage, she says, as if that's supposed to help. It's a soup-like mixture of grains, a few unidentifiable vegetables, and possibly pigeon. Pottage is the go-to meal for peasants. Boiled over and over again, sometimes for days, and whatever goes in stays in. If a carrot falls in on Monday and you're still scooping spoonfuls by Friday, that's just efficient cooking. Medieval life, especially for the lower classes, revolved around survival eating. You didn't plan meals, you accepted whatever was edible and available. It wasn't about cuisine, it was about sustenance. And that meant eating things that today would land a restaurant on the evening news. You eye a hunk of bread on the corner of the stall. It's flat, heavy, and suspiciously pale. This is probably maslin bread, made with a desperate mix of rye, barley, oats, and maybe some wheat if you're lucky. But let's be honest, you're not. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but when grain was scarce or spoiled, bakers mixed in cheaper substitutes like chalk, ground beans, or even sawdust. You bite it anyway, because hunger. One mainstream historical fact. For most peasants in Europe, especially between the 9th and 14th centuries, food was a monotonous repetition of grains, root vegetables, and weak ale. Proteins were rare luxuries unless you lived near the sea or were skilled at accidental poaching. Now, look, over there's a cart with fish. You think it might be trout, but it smells like it lost a fight with a compost heap. That's because medieval preservation methods were, let's say, enthusiastically optimistic. Fish was often dried or salted beyond recognition, then rehydrated and boiled until edible-ish. Even nobles often doused it in vinegar or spices to cover the stench. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the smell of cooking was used to calculate rent. The idea was if you were emitting delicious aromas, you must be eating above your station. So authorities would sniff around for violators, medieval food policing, complete with a literal nose for trouble. Your stomach turns a little, not just from the smells, but the sheer griminess of it all. No one's washing their hands. Food is being handled, dropped, picked back up, and passed around again. Children are licking their fingers and then helping with the serving. Germ theory hasn't even been born yet, so bacteria is just part of the seasoning. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely enjoyed their food or if they simply learned not to complain. Surviving recipe books, usually written by or for the upper classes, indicate a taste for the rich and exotic. But for most people, the day-to-day was a mushy, moldy, mealy grind. You wander deeper into the crowd, past a man selling something he proudly calls a meat pasty. It's warm, flaky, and suspiciously shaped. You ask him what's in it, and he winks. You do not want to know. Over the years, food became a class divide so sharp you could slice turnips with it. While the wealthy experimented with extravagant dishes, sculpted foods, and imported spices, the average person boiled, baked, or roasted whatever the land coughed up. Foraging was essential: nettles, turnip tops, dandelion greens. Things you wouldn't recognize as food today were practically fine dining then. And yet, amid the grayness and gruel, there were occasional surprises. Seasonal fruits, wild berries, or a gifted egg could brighten an entire week. These weren't just ingredients, they were events. Still, you're getting sleepy, trudging back through the muck of the marketplace with a belly half full of something mushy. A sleepy rooster crows. Someone nearby argues about the price of cabbage. A child licks a rock. Typical day. Tomorrow it'll be pottage again. Always pottage. You wake, or maybe you never really slept, in a straw-stuffed cot that smells faintly of damp wool and regret. Morning has broken, and with it comes another reminder that you're hungry. Again, always. You shuffle toward the communal hearth where breakfast is, as usual, a bowl of something brown and lukewarm. It's pottage again. The flavor hasn't changed, and neither has the texture. But today it has a little lump that might be a bean, which honestly feels like a party. Someone hands you a heel of bread, the same kind from yesterday, rough, chewy, with a hint of sand. That's not an accident. Bread wasn't just bad. It was abrasive. Bakers often added fillers to stretch out precious flour, and sometimes that meant powdered chalk, clay, or ground bone. Tooth loss wasn't just a dental issue. It was a mealtime hazard. Welcome to the flavorless feast of the feudal table. The medieval diet was brutally repetitive for most people. Peasants, serfs, and tradesfolk lived on the margins of society, of flavor, of nourishment itself. Food was fuel, not pleasure. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner were largely the same. Porridge, bread, weak ale, maybe a turnip or two if you were fancy. No variety, no spice rack, no snacks. And no, there were no cozy stews simmering gently over open fires unless you had meat, which most people didn't. Meat was expensive, hunted land was restricted, and livestock was too valuable alive. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. If you killed them, you better be very hungry or very rich. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The average medieval peasant in England ate about 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day, mostly from bread and ale. That might sound fine, until you remember they were doing hard physical labor from dawn till dusk. You squint at a small bowl of what's meant to be breakfast ale. It's more like sour, bready tea. Ale was the drink of choice not because everyone was looking for a good time, but because water could be deadly. More on that in abit.so. You eat your bread. Slowly. Because here's a fun detail. If you didn't eat fast, someone or something might take it. Cats, dogs, rats, and children operated on a you snooze, you lose food policy. Mealtime was chaotic. No forks, no personal plates. Just trenches, those hollowed-out slabs of stale bread used as edible bowls, and fingers. Lots of fingers. And if you dropped food on the floor, 5-second rule didn't exist because everything had already been on the floor. The dirt, straw, animal droppings, and whatever the neighbor dumped out of her chamber pot this morning. Flavor enhancers of the worst kind. A quirky tidbit. Some homes had a communal spoon tied to a beam near the hearth. Everyone shared it. So next time you're annoyed you can't find your favorite fork, imagine arguing with 6 other people over a splintered spoon on a string. But at least food was fresh, right? Not really. Preservation was unreliable, storage was primitive, and winters were long. Root vegetables and grains were stored in cellars, but they rotted quickly. Grains could become infested with weevils or mold, and vegetables often turned before they were eaten. So fresh often meant not spoiled enough to kill you yet. You drag yourself through another day, farm work, tanner's labor, shepherding, whatever your medieval job might be, and all the while you think about dinner. Except dinner is just breakfast again, maybe slightly warmer. Historians still argue whether the monotony of the medieval diet led to widespread malnutrition. Some records show peasants fared better nutritionally than early industrial workers, thanks to whole grains and constant movement. Others point to signs of stunted growth, rickets, and tooth decay as evidence that their food was barely doing the job. The evening meal is almost ready. Your neighbor is chewing on something and swears it's duck, but you're unconvinced. You make a mental note to ask how she acquired it. Then you decide not to ask. Over by the hearth, someone's cooking greens that smell suspiciously bitter. Wild dandelions or nettles, maybe, edible technically, but bitter enough to make you wince. Meanwhile, someone else is trying to make a pudding. Not the soft, sweet kind you're thinking of. Medieval puddings were dense, savory blobs made with oats or animal blood or both, wrapped in intestine or cloth, and boiled for hours until they became whatever the opposite of appetizing is. You try not to think about it. You chew. You swallow. You survive. The truth is, flavor as we know it didn't exist for most medieval people. Salt was precious. Spices were for nobles. Herbs were scarce. Sugar was virtually unknown. Meals were defined by temperature and texture, not taste. Warm and wet or cold and hard was about as specific as it got. You walk back to your cot, licking breadcrumbs from your fingers. Tomorrow might be better. Or not. There's talk of a bad harvest coming. You stare into the dying embers of the hearth and imagine a world with cheese that isn't blue on accident. Sleep creeps in slowly, with the taste of stale rye on your tongue. It's barely light out, and already the air smells exotic. Someone nearby is boiling something with a scent that actually makes sense. You follow your nose, which leads you to a narrow alley where a traveling merchant is stirring a small copper pot. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, maybe even nutmeg. The aroma is surreal, a moment of brightness in your otherwise flavorless gray world. You peer into his cart. There are tiny pouches of color, ground ginger, saffron threads, something red that might be paprika but probably isn't. The merchant, clad in layers of dusty wool, explains he's just returned from a port town. The spices came a long way, maybe from India, maybe from Egypt, maybe from a warehouse in Venice. Honestly, it's hard to tell. But it's clear these spices are valuable. He keeps them in tightly knotted bags, guarded by a short sword and an even shorter temper. Here's the mainstream historical fact. In the Middle Ages, spices were among the most expensive commodities in Europe. Pepper was so valuable it was sometimes used to pay rent or dowries. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg could only be afforded by the wealthy, and even then, sparingly. Your average peasant might live and die without ever tasting black peppered, so how did these rare seasonings make their way onto medieval plates at all? Because, and this is the unfortunate truth, they weren't just for flavor. Often, spices were used to cover up the smell, and sometimes the taste, of meat that had aged poorly. You know, the kind that could stare back at you if it had one more day. With no refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and masking the decay became an art form. Hence, the spice. It's the medieval version of putting cologne on instead of showering. You're not solving the problem, you're just redirecting it. And yet, spices held this strange dual identity, luxury and necessity. Nobles would flaunt their wealth by overspicing everything. A single banquet might use up what a small village could never afford in a year. Imagine stewed lamb with cinnamon, cardamom-laced quail, even sweet pastries dusted with saffron, all on the same table. It sounds lavish, until you remember that nobody had brushed their teeth in a week and everything is being eaten with greasy hands off communal trenchers. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval spice mixes included substances that weren't even edible. Think brick dust or powdered lead, sold as coloring agents for sauces. Not deadly in small doses, probably, but it really does add a certain edge to dinner. Back in the alley, the merchant tries to sell you a single peppercorn, just one, for the price of a week's bread. You laugh, then realize he's serious. That's when it hits you, spices are currency. Not metaphorically, literally. Some European cities had secure vaults just for pepper. Sailors were paid partly in cloves. You're basically sniffing medieval gold dust. Historians still argue whether spices were truly used to disguise rotten food or if that's a modern myth exaggerated by Victorian writers. Some say wealthy households had access to fresh meat and used spices for culinary creativity. Others insist the volume of spices listed in recipes only makes sense if you're trying to kill the taste of something vile. The debate continues, wafting like saffron steam from a suspicious stew. You keep walking. At the next corner. A baker's boy is running down the street with a sack of sweet spice. A medieval blend of sugar, if they had it, cinnamon, and nutmeg, usually reserved for pies or custards at noble feasts. He's probably delivering it to someone who owns a wall. That's always a clue someone's important. You won't see sweet spice again for a very long time. Still, the idea of flavor lingers with you all day. You try chewing on a bit of mint from the edge of a herb patch. It's bitter but refreshing. Somewhere, a kitchen maid is rubbing crushed garlic into a slab of dried mutton, and it smells like hope. You reflect on how odd it is that the most desirable ingredients in the medieval world were ones you could barely taste by modern standards. Medieval palates were used to extremes, either total blandness or a sensory overload of sour, spicy, and sickly sweet all in one dish. Subtlety didn't really have a place at the table as night falls. You hear music from a nearby manor house. Another banquet, probably featuring roasted swan dusted with ginger, or pigeon pies glazed with saffron. The cook might even toss a whole handful of pepper into the soup, an ostentatious flex of wealth and ignorance, because who even likes that much pepper? And yet, in a world where most people are eating the same meal 3 times a day for decades, even a tiny pinch of spice could feel like transcendence. A second of real flavor, a flicker of joy. You crawl into bed, mouth dry from the day's grain paste and watered ale. You dream of peppercorns, of ginger, of taste. It's raining again, which means the roads have turned to syrupy mud, and the ceiling leaks just enough to land on your forehead whenever you try to sleep. Still, the morning meal must happen. You drag yourself to the kitchen, or more accurately, the smoky corner of your home where a small hearth does its best to impersonate one. But there's a problem today. You're out of bread. Not just you, but the entire neighborhood. Why? Because the miller's donkey broke its leg, and now the flour isn't getting ground. The town only has one functional watermill, and when it breaks, or the miller decides to get extra greedy, things come to a halt. So today, you're reminded of a not-so-fun truth. Bread isn't just a side dish. It's everything. Mainstream historical fact: in most of medieval Europe, 70 to 80% of a person's caloric intake came from bread. It was the literal foundation of survival. From coarse barley loaves to rye trenchers and the occasional rare white wheat bread reserved for the elite, bread was more than food, it was social status. But that status was moldy. You remember the bread from earlier in the week. It crumbled in your hand, dense and grayish, the result of low-quality grain mixed with fillers like peas, beans, and sometimes even tree bark. That's not poetic imagery. Some bakers stretched dough with sawdust and ground nutshells when supplies were tight. Oh, and let's not forget Erascatism, better known by its nickname, St. Anthony's Fire, caused by eating rye infected with a fungus called ergot. It led to hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene. You'd think bread couldn't kill you slowly and dramatically, but medieval Europe begged to differ. Historians still argue whether poor bread was more dangerous than helpful, especially during famine years. Some claim bread kept the population afloat. Others say it poisoned more than it fed. It probably did both, depending on the year and who was baking. You head to the bakehouse to see if anything's ready, and you're greeted by the sight of scorched loaves pulled from a communal oven, black on the outside, raw on the inside. The baker shrugs. His oven has no thermometer, no consistent firewood, and no time to waste. And honestly, you're lucky to even have a baker. In many towns, you were required to bake at the Lord's oven and pay a fee for the privilege. Making bread at home could result in a fine, or worse, a suspicious fire you couldn't explain. You trade your last egg for a small barley loaf. It's warm, it's heavy, and it might still contain a pebble or two. You take a bite. Tastes like effort. Takes 3 chews before your jaw decides to participate. But there's something worse than bad bread. No bread. During failed harvests or sieges, people turn to acorns, moss, or even boiled leather shoes to fill the void. A quirky tidbit: in France, starving peasants were known to make famine bread out of ferns. You have to wonder who was the first to point at a fern and say, "Yeah, that'll work." This kind of desperation was why bread riots weren't uncommon. When grain prices rose, townspeople snapped, because when the bread stops, society cracks. The line between peasant and criminal shrinks fast when you're hungry and your kids are crying. Still, bread was a symbol of comfort, even in its worst form. It was always there, even when it really shouldn't have been. You remember the friar down the road who preached that every loaf was a gift from God. Even if it could chip your tooth, that's another thing. The feel of bread mattered. Nobles got soft, finely milled wheat bread. Manchit. The rest of you get maslin, a mix of rye, barley, and mystery grit. Some medieval recipes even suggest intentionally letting loaves go stale to use them as trenchers. Edible plates that soaked up grease and flavor during meals. Afterward, they were fed to dogs, beggars, or thrown into the river. You walk back with your precious loaf. You'll make it last. Maybe crumble it into broth. Maybe smear on some lard, if you're lucky. You pass a monastery wall, and for a moment, the smell of warm, yeasty heaven floats down. Monks had better ovens, better grain, and critically better connections. They baked regularly, and their bread was known for being fresher and finer. If you were starving and desperate enough, you might hang near the gates just in case they handed out alms. Inside your hut, you finally eat. The bread's dry, but you have some broth made from turnip greens and a hint of smoked fish bones. You dip, you chew, you breathe through your nose to pretend there's flavor. Then, because you've heard this trick from a traveler, you heat a small stone near the hearth and place it inside the pot. Supposedly, it draws out flavor. That's probably not true, but it makes you feel clever, and sometimes feeling clever is the only seasoning you've got. You wake to the grumble of your own stomach and the faint scratching sound of rats trying to steal what little remains of last night's broth. You scare them off with a boot and lean over the hearth. It's cold, again, which means there's no breakfast waiting for you, unless you count the leftover turnip greens slowly wilting in a bucket of rainwater. This is a good time to reflect on a strange, inescapable fact. Almost everything you eat tastes sour. Not zesty, not tangy, just plain old fermented, borderline spoiled sour. Why? Because medieval food storage was barely a concept. Without refrigeration, pickling and fermenting weren't just occasional flavor experiments. They were survival tactics. You've probably noticed already that your milk isn't really milk. It's buttermilk or whey, or worse, curdled into a soft cheese you have to scrape with a knife. And yet, this is considered a luxury, because fresh milk spoils within a day, and unless you live next to a cow and own the cow, you're probably not seeing much of it anyway. Mainstream historical fact: medieval Europeans relied heavily on preservation methods that altered the taste of food. Pickling in vinegar, fermenting in brine, curing with smoke and salt, drying until your teeth protested. The result? A daily diet that often leaned acidic, smoky, or just aggressively salty. You take a sip of weak ale with breakfast. It's not because you're trying to get buzzed before noon. It's because it's safer than water. The local stream has been suspiciously frothy ever since someone started dumping fish guts upstream. You don't want to think about it. Quirky tidbit for the day: people used to ferment grain gruel in open pots and drink the liquid as a kind of proto-beer. It was called small ale, and it was so mild that even children drank it. And honestly, probably tasted like warm, soggy cereal. But at least it didn't kill you. Probably. You head out to help in the garden, where cabbages seem to grow with unstoppable determination. They're the weeds of medieval nutrition. You boil them, pickle them, stew them with onions, and yet they always taste like they're slightly punishing you. Still, they're better than dried fish. Oh yes, the fish. You remember when your neighbor gifted you a piece of salted herring. You were excited, until you realized it was essentially a medieval chew toy. Rock hard, eye-watering, and coated in a thick layer of salt that made your lips pucker. It takes a full day of soaking just to make it chewable, and even then it tastes like regret. And yet, during Lent and other fasting days, which, by the way, make up over a third of the year, it's all you get. No meat, just fish, sometimes eel, sometimes lamprey, sometimes something that calls itself fish but looks suspiciously like snake. Historians still argue whether the medieval obsession with fasting was more about religious piety or just an attempt to stretch out food supplies. One theory says that monks set the tone and the rest of society followed. Another suggests it was a clever way to make food rationing feel virtuous. Either way, today is a fast day, so you're avoiding meat. Not that you have any. You boil cabbage again. You sip ale. You chew a crust of rye bread until your jaw aches. And you realize everything you eat is either sour, soggy, or salty. There is no crispy. There is no crunchy. There is only chew. You remember the time someone invited you to a feast. It wasn't a real feast, but more like a town celebration where the local lord threw scraps at the peasants from a raised platform. You caught a bit of cheese, goat's milk, hard as bone, aged to the point of combat readiness. But for 10 glorious seconds, it was yours. Then a dog bit your hand and ran off with it. You sigh. Tonight you have something special. A little crock of sour ale porridge. It's not bad. You cook it until it bubbles and stir in a few onion tops. A visiting cousin once told you the trick is to add a pinch of ashes from a clean fire. It thickens the porridge and might even help with digestion. You do it. You don't taste a difference. But the placebo effect is real, and sometimes that's enough. As you eat, you watch the neighbor try to trade a jar of pickled eggs for 2 apples. No one bites. Everyone knows those eggs were pickled during the bad month, when the chickens were acting strange. They have that green tinge that makes people whisper. You go to bed with a belly that's not full, but not entirely hollow either. That counts as a win. Your last thought before sleep is a weird one. What did food used to taste like? Before all this pickling and souring and preserving, you'll probably never know. You wake up to the rattle of hooves on packed dirt. A tax collector is in town, and the baker's apprentice is already sobbing. That's how you know it's going to be a weird food day. Because today, your meal isn't about what you eat, but who owns it. You see, medieval food wasn't just governed by availability or flavor. It was a tangle of rules, rights, and punishments that made even a boiled turnip feel political. Let's start with the basics. The land you live on, it's not yours. The grain you grow, you owe a portion of it to your feudal lord. The pig you raise, guess who gets the best cut when it's time to slaughter? Spoiler, not you. Mainstream historical fact. In feudal Europe, food production was tightly bound to social hierarchy. Lords owned the land, peasants worked it, and everyone owed tithes to the church. That meant a typical farmer gave away a hefty chunk of their harvest, their livestock, and sometimes their bread, just to stay out of trouble so that loaf of rye you worked all week to make. Congratulations, it now belongs to someone who's never harvested a thing in his life and still complains about the crust. You pass the manor house on your way to the fields. There's a smell wafting from the kitchen. Roasted goose with herbs, probably a bread pudding laced with honey. None of it's for you. You're just there to drop off your owed eggs. You try not to glare at the steward. He inspects the eggs like he's judging art, not breakfast. One is slightly cracked. He tosses it away with a sneer. That's your protein for the week. Gone. And it gets worse. Quirky tidbit of the day. In some towns, people had to use the Lord's wine press or bread oven and pay a fee for it, called a banalite. So even if you grew your own grapes or milled your own flour, you still paid someone else for permission to eat. That's like growing tomatoes and paying your landlord to chew. But maybe the most baffling food rule? The forest laws. You wander into the woods, thinking about snagging a rabbit or picking mushrooms. But hold on, if the Lord has designated this forest as his personal hunting ground, even thinking about taking game is a punishable offense. Poaching could land you in prison or worse, mutilation. All because you wanted stew. Historians still argue whether these strict food ownership laws were a means of social control or a desperate way to organize limited resources. Some argue that rationing access helped preserve land and game. Others say it kept the poor permanently dependent on the rich. Maybe it was both. You spot a friend sneaking back from the woods, a stringy pheasant hidden under their cloak. You don't ask questions. You nod. It's the medieval version of don't snitch. Back in town, the church is collecting food tithes. They take grain, wine, cheese, even onions. In return, you might get a prayer or a sermon about gluttony, which hits harder when you haven't had meat in a week. And yet, the irony? Monasteries often ate better than everyone else. They had gardens, livestock, skilled cooks. During feast days, monks dined on elaborate meals with layered stews, fish pies, and sweetened almond milk. You, meanwhile, nibble on a cold root vegetable and try to remember what sugar tastes like. Still, some days you get lucky. A noble wedding, a saint's feast day, or, if the tax collector is feeling generous, a thin slice of dried apple from the manor's storehouse. You savor it like it's cake d'ete night. The village gathers to share a pot of pottage. It's a thick soup made of whatever's lying around. Beans, cabbage, carrots, herbs, maybe a bone for flavor if someone traded well. You sip it slowly, knowing it might be all there is for days. You catch yourself fantasizing about food you'll never eat. Roasted boar with rosemary, almond tarts, grilled peaches. But then someone tells a joke. Something about the steward getting trampled by a goose, and you laugh. Not because it's that funny, but because laughing while eating cabbage soup makes it go down easier. As you crawl into bed, you think, food isn't just food. It's politics. It's power. It's how they remind you that your place is near the bottom of the ladder, chewing on a root. But hey, at least no one stole your last onion this week. The frost has started creeping in around the edges of the shutters, and you can feel it before you even open your eyes. The chill wraps around your bones like a second skin, and your first thought isn't about warmth, it's about food. Because when winter tightens its grip, food gets strange. And not in a fun way, you trudge out to check your stores. A few wrinkled onions, a jug of dried peas, a slab of smoked pork so salty it could preserve you. The garden is frozen solid. The chickens aren't laying. And unless the snow thaws soon, you're not getting fresh anything for weeks. Welcome to the season of food that bites back. Mainstream historical fact: winter in the medieval period was not just cold, it was brutal for food. With no refrigeration and limited preservation options, most families relied on salted, dried, and smoked goods stored during the fall. But if your harvest was weak or your storage methods failed, starvation wasn't just a concept. It was a calendar event that so you ration. You slice your onions thinner. You water down your broth. You hide your bread so you don't eat it all in a single sitting. You find creative ways to pretend turnip soup is a meal with depth. But let's talk about your best friend this season: salt. You'd think it was gold, judging by how carefully you guard your stash. It's in everything: meat, fish, even cheese. Salt keeps food from spoiling. It also makes everything taste like it's daring your kidneys to revolt. You remember helping your uncle salt pork in the cellar. It was a ritual, slab after slab, layered with salt, pressed under boards. The smell was overwhelming, but it was the scent of survival. Too little salt and the meat rotted. Too much and it became unchewable. And let's not forget dried legumes. Peas and beans were the backbone of poor winter diets. They soak for hours, sometimes days. Then you boil them until they surrender into a paste. Add a little mustard seed if you're fancy. Otherwise, it's brown, it's bland, and it binds your insides tighter than the village gossip circle. Quirky tidbit? In some regions, people made pea sausage, a thick paste of dried peas stuffed into animal intestines and boiled into a solid log. It's not glamorous, it's not colorful, but it fills a hole, kind of like edible insulation. You spot your neighbor hanging dried apples from a beam, twisting them gently so they don't mold. You've done the same. Your winter fruits are leathery but still sweet enough to convince your mouth it's getting a treat. You trade two for a knob of old cheese. The cheese has gone soft around the edges, and it smells like something died doing its duty. But when you shave off the mold and melt it over bread, it's edible. That's your new standard. Edible. Historians still argue whether winter hunger shaped medieval culture more than religion. After all, the fear of an empty storehouse could turn peaceful villages into angry mobs. It's no coincidence that food riots and peasant uprisings often happened in February and March, the infamous hungry months. Even the church adjusted for the season. Fast days were stricter, yes, but there was leniency in how you defined a meal. Fish counted as non-meat, so did beaver tails for some reason. That led to some impressively creative culinary gymnastics. Eels baked in pies, frogs boiled in herbs, porpoises served with vinegar. Not that you're seeing any of that, you get porridge. Again, you start chewing slower. Your body adapts. It always does. At night, you tuck your food into cloth sacks and hang them from the ceiling to keep mice out. You light a small fire, rationing your wood just as tightly as your food. And you find yourself doing something strange, talking to your stew pot. Just a little, just enough to feel like you're not the only thing creaking in the cold. Someone mentioned spring. You don't dare hope for it. Hope is for people with full root cellars and good boots. Still, you imagine a green sprout, one tiny leaf pushing through thawed dirt. Future meal, something not gray or brown. But for now, you chew your leathery pork, swallow your sour cabbage, sip your thin ale, and tell yourself it's enough. Because it has to be. You wake to the smell of something. Not good, not bad, just strong. Someone in the neighboring cottage is cooking with garlic again. A lot of it. You try not to gag. Medieval food isn't just about what it tastes like. It's about how it smells. And often, the nose suffers first. You shuffle to the hearth and poke at a pot that's been stewing since yesterday. A sludge of lentils, garlic, onion, and maybe, if you squint hard enough, a scrap of smoked meat. The scent is sharp and earthy, like someone brewed a compost tea and forgot to strain it. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval kitchens lacked chimneys for much of the era. That meant cooking was done over open hearths, with smoke pouring into the room and clinging to everything. Your clothes, your hair, your food. It seasoned every meal with a hint of burnt ash and lung strain, which means you rarely smell food the way we do today. Delicate, wafting aromas designed to entice. Instead, you smell fire, rot, salt, sweat, and garlic. So much garlic. You sit with your porridge bowl and try to eat while not thinking about the lingering smell of the fish the blacksmith cooked last week. It still haunts the village like a culinary ghost. But here's the real kicker. Spices. You've heard of them. Exotic powders from the east. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, even black pepper. The rich coat their meat in them, not to preserve the food, as some myths say, but to flex. Spices were status symbols. They turned bad meat into a nobleman's feast. not by hiding the rot, but by showing off wealth. You have mustard seeds and a hope. Quirky tidbit? In some towns, people made a crude substitute for pepper by roasting dried berries or grinding up charcoal-dusted seeds. It looked like pepper. It even fooled guests. But one taste and you'd know you've been peasant tricked. You chew on a slice of rye, a loaf so dense it could double as building material. Smell? Slightly sour with a touch of mildew. Has been sitting under a linen cloth for days. But bread doesn't go bad in the sense that fruit does. It just evolves into a defensive weapon. You dip it into the stew. The flavor is muted, like someone described a vegetable from another room and the pot overheard it. Historians still argue whether taste mattered to medieval people at all. Some say it was all about fuel, eating to survive, not to enjoy. Others believe that even peasants craved flavor, experimenting with local herbs, root pastes, and pungent dairy just to feel something on their tongues. You'd agree with the latter, because when you find a good patch of wild thyme or pennyroyal and sprinkle it over boiled barley, it almost tastes like food made on purpose. You head out later to the village green, where someone's trying to trade dried wild garlic for goose fat. It's a ridiculous deal, but smell matters. Goose fat makes things rich, slick, and savory. Garlic makes things loud. In both scent and after effects, a man boasts that his cottage smells of bay leaves. You try not to laugh. That's not bay. That's moldy hay. Later, the local priest warns everyone about smells of sin. He means the kitchen stinks during Lent. You're pretty sure even God has turned his nose up. And yet, there are good smells, too. Bread baking in a village oven, wood smoke laced with rosemary, apples drying over a low fire. They're rare, but when they happen, you stop what you're doing and breathe. It's why feasts are such a shock. The Lord hosts a celebration, and the air changes. Spit-roasted meat, pastry crusts, honeyed nuts. You catch the scent on the wind and suddenly forget every soggy cabbage you've ever eaten. But it's fleeting. Back home, you light a bundle of dried lavender, not for flavor, but for mercy. It softens the stew smell, sort of. You imagine you're rich. You imagine cinnamon on your tongue. Then you sneeze into your broth and decide garlic might be enough for now. The morning is gray and wet, typical of this part of the year, and you're not even sure if it's morning or just another endless stretch of cold, muddy hours. It's hard to tell time when the sun barely breaks through, like a hint of light too shy to show up properly. But you've got something today, something important. A market day. That means you don't have to settle for the same stale bread and miserable pottage. You're walking into a small miracle where, for a fleeting moment, you get a choice in what goes into your stomach. It's like being handed the keys to a castle. Except, well, it's more like a wooden stall with a lot of squawking chickens. But still, you shuffle to the market square, where the sound of bartering fills the air. The fishmonger is arguing with a woman over a soggy mackerel. The baker's offering bread for pennies, though you don't know why anyone would want it. The smell is predictably damp. Even bread isn't safe from the wetness of the season. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval markets were places of opportunity, but they were also the heart of the food economy. Peasants would bring whatever surplus they had, if they had any, to trade for items they couldn't produce. This could include grains, vegetables, or homemade cheeses. But the prices could vary wildly, depending on the season, the weather, and who controlled the trade routes. You've been saving your pennies, so you head straight for the meat stall. there's a sliver of hope that today, just maybe, you'll score a small cut of lamb. Something that doesn't taste like salted leather. The butcher, an imposing figure with a ruddy face and a sharp knife, eyes you suspiciously as you approach. "You got your coins?" he grunts. The stall is filled with less than fresh cuts of meat that have been hanging a bit too long. Yet the promise of something tender is enough to make you try. You offer your money. The butcher leans in and hands you a chunk of meat with a flick of his wrist, all the while sizing you up like you've come for a prize, not scraps. And then, as if to add insult to injury, he tosses you a side of turnips, because what's meat without root vegetables? Quirky tidbit. In some medieval markets, even haggling was a form of art. The better you were at negotiating, the more likely you were to secure better food, or at least not pay too much for something that's still half alive. There are stories of peasants coming out of market with a full feast and a full wallet, all thanks to a few carefully chosen words and hand gestures. It's not fair, but that's the game. You take your sad lamb and turnips, feeling as if you've won a battle, though you know it's really more of a draw. The rest of the market isn't much better. A few jars of pickled cucumbers, some dried herbs, and baskets of sour apples. If you were rich, you could afford a spice mix that could turn your humble stew into something resembling a gourmet dish. But today, it's salt and vinegar. Again, you pause by the ale stall, drawn by the scent of something that could be beer or could be something else entirely. You can't tell. It's thick and pungent, like the scent of an old wooden cask that's seen better days. You get a small cup, just enough to remind you of what it's like to feel full of something other than uncertainty. The vendor raises an eyebrow as you sip. "Not bad for a penny," he says with a smirk. You nod in agreement, but it's not the drink you crave. It's the idea that this is all you get today. The little joys, the fleeting things. You return home with your spoils, weary from the market's bustle. At the door, a child runs past, laughing. They've clearly been fed something sweet today. You wonder, not for the first time, when you'll taste honey again. You've heard stories about its rich, golden color, how it coats the tongue with warmth. Right now, it's a far-off dream. Historians still argue whether markets were more about survival or social interaction. Some believe they were the true heart of medieval life, where a village could be as vibrant as it was struggling. Others say they were just another reminder of the inequalities. Either way, they were loud and colorful, for the brief time they lasted. You lay your meager haul on the table and start chopping the turnips. Lamb stew. It's going to be good, at least in theory. You try not to think about how your fingers smell like raw meat and market dust. After all, it's better than having nothing at all, right? You're sitting by the fire now, poking at your stew like it owes you money. The lamb was tough, the turnips watery, and somehow, it all tastes faintly of smoke and disappointment. But at least it's hot. Heat counts for something when the wind whistles through the cracks in your cottage walls like it's got gossip to spread as you lean back and breathe in the mingling sense of broth and damp wood. You begin to wonder, how did anyone in this era decide what was safe to eat? The short answer, they didn't. Not always. Mainstream historical fact. Food safety in the medieval world was a mixture of guesswork, superstition, and trial and error that often ended in stomach aches or worse. There were no expiration dates, no refrigeration, and no FDA to protect you from that suspicious-looking sausage hanging in your neighbor's pantry. You learned by doing, and by watching who didn't survive dinner. You sipped the broth carefully, aware of the little floating bits of who knows what. and mentally pray it doesn't turn into an overnight regret. Medieval food hygiene was an ongoing battle, and let's just say, the food often won. You remember a story an old woman told about a baker who added chalk to his flour to stretch it further. It made the loaves pretty but brittle until people started getting sick. He was banned from the market and, rumor had it, spent his last days trying to eat tree bark in the woods. Probably not the retirement plan he envisioned. Quirky tidbit: in some areas, people believe that placing an iron knife across your bread while slicing it would cut out bad spirits that might have crept into the dough. So now, instead of worrying about mold or parasites, you've got to deal with angry ghosts in your breakfast. Even the church got involved. They issued food blessings, feast day rules, and fasting guidelines, not just for spiritual reasons, but because controlling food gave them social power. Historians still argue whether this was more about piety or politics. Were fasts about honoring God, or just clever ways to stretch limited food supplies under the cloak of holiness? You've seen more than one priest break a fast with fish so rich and sauced it could make a pig jealous. Technically, it wasn't meat. Spiritually, that fish had definitely sinned. But sometimes food just turns on you. You remember that time someone brought home a barrel of salted herring from the coast. It smelled fine at first. Then, one by one, everyone who ate it spent the next 2 days doubled over, groaning like cows in labor. The culprit? Bad brining. The fish was barely preserved, and the warm journey back didn't help. Lesson learned. If it smells too fishy, it probably has plans for your insides. Of course, there were household tricks. You tossed questionable eggs into water. If they floated, they were bad. If they sank, you had a fighting chance. And sometimes, if the bread had too many black specks, you just cut those parts out and try not to think about them too hard. Ignorance is bliss, especially when it's mold-related. You once tried to explain food poisoning to a neighbor. She squinted and said, "That's just what happens when your stomach sins before your mouth does." You nodded, partly out of politeness and partly because, well, she wasn't entirely wrong. You glanced down at your stew again, now cooled and congealing. The fat has risen to the top in sad little islands. You dip your bread and try to ignore the way it clings like wet wool. Food was judged not by flavor, but by consequences. That if you made it through the night without cramps or fever, it was a good meal. If not, well, better luck next pot. You remember visiting a nearby village where someone invented a safe eating chant to mutter before meals. It involved clapping, twirling once, and shouting, "Clean pig, clean plate," 3 times. It didn't help, but it felt like it should. Historians still debate whether the lower classes had better immunity due to constant exposure to unsanitary food. Some argue they built stronger stomachs. Others say they just died younger. You're not sure which side you're on, but you do know that your stomach has grown more suspicious with each year. At the end of the day, you do what everyone does. You cook it long, you smell it hard, and if it doesn't scream or crawl away, you eat it. And maybe, just maybe, you light a candle and whisper a prayer to St. Bartholomew, the patron saint of stomach ailments, just in case. It's one of those evenings when the sun slips behind the hills early, leaving the village in a cold hush, broken only by the thump of someone chopping firewood and the occasional sheep that doesn't know when to quit bleeding. You sit near your hearth again, trying to coax warmth from the embers, thinking about dinner. Or rather, what counts as dinner? Tonight, you've got a bowl of boiled grain that might be barley, might be wheat. At this point, who can tell? It's gray, thick, and has the consistency of wet gravel. You stare into it and remember something curious. Why does it always look like this? And why, you ask, was texture in medieval food so aggressively disappointing? Mainstream historical fact. Most medieval meals, especially for the lower classes, were boiled, mashed, or stewed into soft, sludgy formats. Not because everyone had sensitive teeth, though many did, but because fuel was precious, ingredients were limited, and long boiling made the most of every scrap. The result? A culinary world ruled by mush. You drag your spoon through the porridge, watching the surface jiggle faintly. No crunch, no crisp, no contrast, just beige monotony. If you squint, you can pretend it's risotto, but only if you've never had risotto. The upper classes, they had it a little better. Their dishes sometimes involved layering, pies filled with spiced meats, fish jellies molded into towers, roasts with stuffing, but even then, texture was more an afterthought than a focus. The goal was spectacle, not mouthfeel. Quirky tidbit? There was once a popular medieval dish called blank manger, a sort of almond milk chicken pudding, thickened with rice and sugar, served cold. To us, that sounds like a mistake someone left on the windowsill. To them, it was the height of refinement. You take a bite of your own version of blank manger minus the chicken, rice, sugar, or refinement. Just oats and salt. It doesn't taste like much, but hey, it won't kill you. Maybe. And then there's the bread again. Always bread. It's the only firm food around, and even that's a gamble. You've bitten loaves that crumble like sandstone, others that chew like rawhide. Sometimes you find a bit of grit in your slice, and that's when you remember the local mill uses stone grinding, and those tiny chips of quartz, they don't bake out. You're slowly sanding your teeth away, one meal at a time. Historians still argue whether peasants preferred their food soft because of bad teeth or because it was easier to digest. Some say the mush was cultural. Others think it was just practical. When you only have a dented pot and a smoky fire, you don't get fussy about texture. Still, you miss crunch. Just something with a little bite. Once, a traveling monk passed through with hard biscuits so tough he needed to soak them in beer before eating. You watched him gnaw on one for 10 minutes. He called it a journey cake. You called it dental warfare. You scrape the bottom of your bowl and sigh. The food sticks like glue, and you realize, not for the first time, that gruel fatigue is real. Then you remember your neighbor's son, who once made something he called crispy cheese. He laid thin curds on a flat rock near the fire and let them dry, turning them into something vaguely like a cracker. The village kids loved it. You tried it once and cracked a molar. And yet, everyone still eats, because that's what you do. You fill the belly, not the soul. You close your eyes and imagine a future, far from now, in some century where ovens have knobs and people choose between textures, where food is crispy, chewy, flaky, smooth, or crunchy on purpose, where nobody stirs oats into water and calls it dinner unless they want .it sounds impossible. It sounds beautiful. But here in the present, texture is a luxury. Food is fuel. And sometimes that fuel looks like beige paste in a wooden bowl. You eat it anyway. The air outside is sharp tonight, wet with fog and faint wood smoke, curling between thatched rooftops like a lazy ghost. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and step into the dark, because tonight you're going hunting, or more accurately, foraging. Because like most people in your station, you don't have land, don't own traps, and don't have the coin to pay someone who does. But what you do have is an eye for weeds. Mainstream historical fact. Foraging was a major source of sustenance in medieval diets, especially for peasants and the working poor. Forests, fields, and even roadside ditches were regularly scoured for wild edibles. Nettles, garlic, berries, mushrooms, and roots. You didn't survive by being picky. You survived by knowing what wouldn't kill you. You head toward the edge of the woods, basket in hand. The ground squishes underfoot. There's an earthy smell to everything: mud, moss, and the faint tang of animal droppings. Delicious. Tonight you're hoping for a few wild onions and maybe some ramsons, those broad-leaved greens that taste like garlic and make your breath tragic for 3 days. Add those to your pottage and suddenly it's like you've added flavor, that rare and precious thing. You pass a patch of mushrooms near a rotting log and stop. They're tempting but dangerous. Quirky tidbit: there was no reliable medieval method to determine edible mushrooms from deadly ones. People relied on tradition, local lore, and sometimes even trial by goat. If a goat ate it and lived, maybe you could too. It's not exactly the scientific method, but it's what you've got. You decide against the mushrooms. You're not in the mood to hallucinate, vomit, or drop dead tonight. Instead, you move to a cluster of brambles. Tiny blackberries cling to the thorns like secrets. You pluck a few, pop them into your mouth. They're sour, but alive with flavor. It's one of the only moments in your day that feels vaguely like joy. You remember when your cousin tried to make hedge pie, a mess of foraged berries, hazelnuts, and some questionable mint crushed into a lump of barley dough and baked on a flat stone. It turned out more like a medieval Pop-Tart, if Pop-Tarts were dry and grim. Still, everyone ate it and pretended to be impressed. Historians still argue whether foraging was done out of desperation or tradition. Some say peasants embraced wild foods because it kept them connected to the land and the seasons. Others claim it was just what you did when the barley ran out and the pigs were gone. Either way, your stomach didn't care. It just wanted something. Further into the woods, you stumble upon some rose hips. You grin. These little red fruit nubs are packed with something you've heard the friar call God's medicine. They're sour enough to make your teeth scream, but when dried and steeped into a hot drink, they warm you like nothing else. Tonight, that'll be your tea, and maybe your dessert. You wander a bit more, collecting sorrel, chickweed, and a few dandelion roots. You remember the old woman in the village who used to call dandelion stew her spring cleanse. She lived to be 84, basically immortal by medieval standards, so maybe there was something to it. The sky grows darker. Owls hoot softly. You wrap your cloak tighter, feeling the first true chill of evening set in. Your basket is half full, but that's enough. Tonight's stew will have a few greens, maybe even depth of flavor. Wild garlic, rosehip tea, and barley mush with chopped dandelion. It's practically a feast. You walk home slowly, carefully, your feet finding the narrow path by moonlight. The village glows faintly ahead, orange dots of candlelight behind shuttered windows. Someone is laughing in the distance. Someone else is coughing. You step inside your cottage and set your findings down. You're tired, hungry, but oddly satisfied. There's something deeply comforting about knowing you've fed yourself with your own 2 hands. Not just scavenged, but selected, curated even, as if medieval cuisine had a personal touch, a terroir, a wildness. And tonight, your pottage will whisper of forest floors and sun-warmed berries. It may still taste like boiled socks, but at least it'll be your socks. You light a candle, pull out your pot, and begin chopping. The pot bubbles gently now, sending up faint wafts of wild garlic and barley steam. You stir it slowly, feeling very medieval, very self-sufficient, and only slightly concerned about the mystery leaf you tossed in last minute. Maybe it was sorrel. Maybe it was something that looks like sorrel but secretly wants you dead. Medieval cooking is nothing if not suspenseful. You ladle a bit into your bowl and take a cautious sip. Okay, edible. Definitely edible. Maybe even good. But before you can bask in your culinary triumph, you remember something annoying. You're not allowed to enjoy this on certain days of the week. Mainstream historical fact. The medieval calendar was absolutely packed with fast days, around 140 per year. That's nearly 40% of your life spent dodging meat, dairy, eggs, and sometimes even oil. Fridays were especially strict, and Lent was the culinary equivalent of a sad trombone. If you were lucky, you got fish. If you weren't, you got boiled peas, you sigh. Tonight's stew is meatless by default. Not by choice, but because you haven't seen actual meat in over a week. You've been pretending that the barley's chew is meat-like, which is a lot like pretending a pebble is a pillow. Historians still argue whether fasting was more about piety or practicality. Did the church truly want to discipline the flesh, or were they just helping communities stretch their food stores by scheduling nationwide no-bacon days? Hard to say. Probably both. Either way, the saints got the prayers, and you got flavorless soup. You remember a clever workaround your neighbor once tried. Fake meat pies made with chopped figs and ground almonds, spiced to taste like pork. Honestly, they didn't. But everyone ate them with the wide-eyed desperation of people pretending to love tofu. And then there was fish bacon. That's not a joke. Wealthier households sometimes cured strips of sturgeon skin with smoke and salt, sliced it thin, and fried it up on fast days. Did it taste like bacon? No. Did it look like bacon? If you squinted hard and were really lonely, maybe. Quirky tidbit? Some monks got wildly creative. In one monastery, there's record of a beaver tail stew eaten during Lent, justified because beavers lived in water, so their tails were declared technically fish. You can't make this up. Well, you could, but the monks already beat you to it. You think about how your life is ruled by the calendar, and not just because of fasts. Feast days meant communal meals, shared bread, and maybe a bit of honey if someone was feeling generous. Then the next day, nothing but peas again. You lived by the church bell and died by the lentil. But some people, some lucky devils, found ways around it. You remember the traveling peddler who sold eels soaked in wine, stuffed into little flasks to sneak past church restrictions. He called it holy syrup. The priest wasn't impressed, but your mouth was. You glance at your pot again and toss in the last of your foraged herbs. If the church asks, it's a fast-friendly stew. If they don't ask, maybe you'll add a scrap of that questionable cheese tucked behind the bread box. It's already gone green. Might as well commit. You sip again. Better. It needs salt, but good luck with that. Salt costs more than you do. You have maybe a pinch left, tucked in a cloth bundle like it's the crown jewels. You sprinkle it in anyway. Tonight's special. You wrap your cloak around your knees and settle in to eat. The stew is warm. It's not amazing, but it feels good, nourishing, grounding. A reminder that food doesn't have to be thrilling. Sometimes, just having it is miracle enough. And even if the church has declared this week flavorless and joyless, your little bowl of greenish pottage says otherwise. Quietly, humbly, and with just a hint of rebellion. The moon's risen higher now, casting a dull silver glaze over the village rooftops. You step outside with your empty bowl, letting the last steam drift into the cool night air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then goes silent. You breathe in deeply, earth, smoke, moss, and something faintly burnt at your full, or at least not hungry, and that's good enough for a night like this. But still, you wonder, wasn't there anything people in your time actually liked to eat? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. Even in this world of boiled roots and banned bacon, people craved flavor. They sought it. Sometimes they even created it. Mainstream historical fact: medieval cooks, especially in noble households, used spices with wild abandon. Not just a pinch of cinnamon here or a dash of pepper there, but combinations that would make a modern chef cry. Clove and saffron in fish, nutmeg in beef pies, ginger in everything. It was like food had to fight back to be interesting. Of course, you don't have access to those spices. They cost more than your hut. Pepper was counted by the grain, saffron was stored under lock and key, and cinnamon was basically currency. But you've tasted it once, at a wedding feast, sweet wine with a sprinkle of something sharp and red gold on top. You still dream about it. Historians still argue whether spices were used for flavor, status, or to cover up the taste of spoilage. You're fairly certain it was all three. Nobody spends a month's wages on nutmeg just to impress their dinner guests. Unless, of course, their meat smells like tragedy. Back in your own kitchen, you think about the spice substitutes the poor had to rely on. Horseradish, mustard seed, wild herbs, ground elder if you were lucky. And if you were really desperate, you just poured vinegar over everything and hoped for the best. There's a bitter comfort in that, knowing you're not alone in the fight against blandness. Your ancestors were desperate to make food taste like something, anything. Even the peasants had their culinary tricks: pickling, smoking, fermenting. You once had turnip wine at a midwinter festival. Tasted like betrayal, but it was memorable. Quirky tidbit: there was a dish in upper-class circles called ambrosia of eggs, a custard spiced with mace, sweetened with honey, and served with rosewater. You heard a nobleman describe it once, as if it were divine. You imagined it for days afterward, lying on your straw mattress, drooling into your blanket. But that's the thing. Food in the Middle Ages was never just food. It was memory, comfort, power, a wish for something better. Even your mother's gray lentil mash had a sort of poetry to it. When it was hot and you were cold and the world outside was made of wolves and wind, it was love in a bowl. You walk back inside and wrap yourself in a blanket, thinking about how taste is tied to longing, and how, even now, in your humble little hovel, you've managed to create something close to pleasure, with a few herbs, a pinch of salt, and a healthy sense of denial. Tomorrow it'll be barley again, or peas, or mystery grains. But for tonight, you had flavor, and that counts for something. The fire's burning low now, crackling softly in its stone cradle. You sit near it, rubbing your hands together, watching embers float up like tiny red spirits. The night feels thick, heavy with sleep, but there's one last thing to ponder before you give in: the medieval obsession with how food was eaten. Because believe it or not, even if the stew was lumpy, the customs surrounding it were anything but casual. Mainstream historical fact: dining in the Middle Ages, especially among the upper classes, was a performance. Everything from table placement to who got to cut the bread was dictated by rigid etiquette. You didn't just eat, you participated in a kind of edible theater. Even in the humbler homes like yours, there were unspoken rules. Bread first, always. Hands washed before eating, usually with a bowl of water and a cloth passed around. No licking fingers, no putting knives in your mouth, and definitely no speaking ill of the cook unless you wanted a turnip to the head. You remember sitting at a feast once, some harvest festival where the whole village shared tables. The Lord's men sat at the center, carving roast goose and flinging jokes like arrows. The rest of you were clustered along the outer benches, breaking dark bread, dipping it into a communal bowl of something soupy, passing cups of weak ale your neighbor coughed directly into the food. You tried to ignore it. You failed. Historians still argue whether medieval communal eating brought people closer or simply helped spread disease faster. Maybe both. You've definitely gotten sick after a few too many friendship bowls. And yet, there's something oddly comforting about the clatter of shared meals. The low hum of conversation, the scrape of spoons, the quiet moment after someone tells a joke and everyone laughs at once. Quirky tidbit? Some wealthier households had dedicated food tasters. Someone whose job was to nibble your meal first to check for poison. You once fantasized about being that person, not because of the danger, but because they got firstbite.in your own home. Things are simpler. You don't have servants. You don't have forks. You have your hands, a knife, and maybe a spoon carved from elm. But you have manners, sort of. You always wait your turn. You always offer the last bite to your youngest sibling. And you always pretend not to notice when someone else steals the bigger portion. There's also the weird obsession with presentation. Even peasant weddings sometimes had dishes sculpted into strange shapes. Boars made from bread, fish molded from mashed beans. You once saw a meat pie with little pastry birds on top. You didn't eat it, but it haunted your dreams. And let's not forget trenchers. Not dinner plates, but stale hunks of bread used as edible dishware. Yours are usually so dry you could roof a house with them. But sometimes, at the end of the meal, they're soaked with just enough juice and broth to be chewable again. That's the good part. That's dessert. The fire pops again, and you feel your eyelids getting heavy. You think about how even the gross foods, the gray stews, the sour wine, the pickled fish with suspicious eyes, still formed the glue of your daily life. They were the background to stories, arguments, births, and songs. They were there when the seasons changed. They got you through winters and weddings, famines and feasts. Tomorrow you'll eat more of the same. Maybe you'll find another patch of garlic. Maybe you'll trade your last egg for a handful of leeks. Maybe you won't eat at all, and you'll just sleep through the hunger until the wind changes. But tonight, fullish and warmish, you finally lie back on your straw mattress, the fire casting soft shadows on the wall. The sounds of the village fade into soft murmurs. A creaking shutter, far-off owl. Somewhere, a dog sighs in its sleep. The fire in your hearth has become a bed of quiet embers. Glowing with slow light, your stomach isn't full, exactly, but it's satisfied. The warmth from the stew lingers in your chest, settling beneath the surface like a slow hum. You feel the curve of the blanket around you, the gentle scratch of homespun fabric against your arms. It's coarse but familiar. Like everything else in this life, it's not perfect, but it's yours. Outside, the wind rustles the thatch. The stars have come out, cold and bright, like specks of bone against the velvet sky. The moon casts a dull glow over the fields, silvering the tops of barley and wheat. Your breathing slows. The stories of the day of weeds turned into meals, of church bells dictating your diet, of stew that tastes vaguely like regret, begin to fade into the warm fog of sleep, and for a moment, you let yourself forget the hunger, the chores, the strange rules of fasting days. You hold on to the memory of rosehip tea and borrowed salt and the faint, improbable joy of warm food on a cold night. Sleep takes you gently, like a slow tide, and the Middle Ages drift softly into silence.